Israel is what happens. It's the same story, except this time God shows up and tries to do something with it, and it doesn't work. And we have two repeating stories in the Old Testament. Okay. And we have some unanswered questions at the end of Kings. What is God going to do about the rebellion of the world? What is God going to do about Israel's exile? Will God rebuild the kingdom of Israel? Is he going to give up? How will the future kingdom be different if he does rebuild? How will the people keep covenant? Who will be the king? How will the king be different? These are the kind of questions that primary history is really launching. It's all the different themes of kingship, the corruption, all the themes of human rebellion, all the themes of a distancing that can God live with people? It's all showing up, and how is that all going to be resolved at the end? Okay? What is the ending to the story? Okay. Those are the unanswered questions of primary history, and that's what we're going to try to answer a bit more when we start looking at prophets. Okay? Because the prophets are going to comment about the story, and they're going to point at the solutions. Okay. Questions? I sped through all this text, sorry. But we had a lot. And I figured we want to have some time for questions before it gets too late. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of it like from contextual point of view. Like these are people writing the story of the kings are in Babylon.
Yes.
And they're reflecting on how they got to be where they were.
Right.
And they probably have some oral history and maybe something written down.
They have probably quite a bit written down. They point to it, like Annals of the Kings. It's very likely at this time there was what they call a Tetratuch. The first four books of Genesis, Exodus, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers were most likely already in some shape, already in existence. Very likely, this is kind of what people are saying these days. I'm not going to tell you that this is, we have any evidence for this at all, because remember, we don't need text. But what people are saying is that somehow there's a Deuteronomy that was independent, and then somebody took the end of Numbers and put it at the end of Deuteronomy, and then created the Judges Kings storyline, and then pulled the whole thing together into this one big narrative. So that's kind of the theory that's out there. But I would say, I think the way you're putting it is probably the best. Somebody in Babylon said, we have a lot of history, I'm going to pull it together, and I'm going to pull it together to explain why we're here.
I mean, I imagine that the number of people who would want to do that would be in the minority. I mean, they've already been defeated. Well, I don't know how.
That's a great question. Keep going. Sorry, go ahead.
They've been defeated. They're captive in Babylon. Some of them are succeeding there, some of them are not. But who would think of going back to Jerusalem? I mean, it's the past.
Right. So here's a very good question. I would say the primary history, whoever put this together, I think our theology would say he's a prophet. That is, he's speaking for God. And this book is intended to answer questions and to generate faith among the people in Babylon. I mean, you're absolutely right. If you're a Jewish person in Babylon, okay, a couple options. First of all, okay, Marduk beats Yahweh. Marduk is bigger and badder than Yahweh. His army just took out our army. Let's go worship Marduk. Let's become Babylonians. Okay. Another possibility is that this Yahweh God has given up on us. Okay, I'm not trusting Marduk. I'm still trusting Yahweh, but Yahweh's given up because we blew it. So there's no hope for us. So we give up. Okay. And then the other option says, okay, if we haven't given up, what is our hope? Okay. What is our hope? Or why are we here? How do we get here? So these are kind of questions that are being answered. You are the children of Abraham. You have a particular commission, but because you failed in your commission, you are now here because of your rebellion. But even in the story, there are hints about the promise to Abraham that's unconditional. There's hints of promise to David that's unconditional. That says there's something that's going to flow out of this. We don't know what, but it's going to come out of this. And we have some future.
Why wouldn't the Babylonian king try to suppress this movement? I mean, if this particular book set of books is kind of providing a particular nationalism or to a subgroup of this, people, you would think that maybe the king is not interested in keeping.
That's a good question. I would say that because they're in Babylon, it's less of an issue, right? They are like a small minority in a big city, right? If you're far away and you're running your own land and you got this thing going on, I'd be a little nervous. But because you're in the capital city, I'm not that concerned. What can you do, right? So I think that's I don't think that's an issue. And Babylonians did not seem to have problems with these texts. These texts became a problem much later, when the Greeks came around. Then they started wanting to burn all these books. So.
But I really like that image of,
Yeah.
Everyone often says that history gets written by the victors, but here's a history written by the losers.
Yes.
And what does this say?
And why we lost. Yes, and why we lost. This is why we lost, and it becomes completely theological. We lost not because our God is weak, but because we actually didn't lose. God attacked us for our failures. Okay, you think Babylon beat us? Babylon didn't beat us. Yahweh did. Okay. That's what happened. So that's if this kingdom was birthed to have a mission to live out God's character and values so as to bless the world. If it fails to do that, it has no residential, it has no reason to exist. Therefore, it gets wiped out. And not only that, it became worse than it's the people that it replaced. Then why have it there? Wipe it out. So that's the logic of the primary history. It ends in a complete disaster.
It feels like there's always been a kind of a remnant even before that word gets coined.
Yes.
All the way from the very beginning.
Yeah. But that shows up in the prophets. Yeah. Not so much here.
Yeah.
Right? Primary history is very stark. The peoples failed, let's ignore them. We need a king. The kings failed. There's nothing left.
Yeah,
There's nothing left.
I hold
Yeah.
very strongly to that one line
Yeah.
that God throws when is it Elijah who's feeling terribly?
There's still 5,000.
There's still
5,000 who hadn't bowed the knees to Baal.
Right.
Yes.
They
So
have been there somewhere.
they have lines like that,
Yeah,
but they
somewhere.
don't show up in the rest of the storyline. They're like, he's led them astray. He led all the people astray. You're absolutely right. It's the primary history. It deals in these absolutes. Okay, absolute failure to the people, absolute failure to the kings. But then you're gonna run into the prophets or people like Ruth, that says, you know what? There's faithfulness in the individuals. There's people around who are doing the right things. There's faithful people in the prophet stories. So the remnant idea is prominent. I agree. I mean, but not in primary history.
No.
Yeah, it has its own logic. I think it's trying to stamp out hope, because it's trying to not stamp out hope. It's trying to stamp out any way to justify. No, sorry. It's trying to justify what God did. You know what I'm saying? God did this. We deserved it. So counter storylines are not helpful. Okay, so I think that's what's going on here.
It's like
So,
a vision of a sinning nation.
yeah, the nation sinned. People are bad. Kings are bad. Boom. End of story. That's really kind of the storyline. Okay, and you can see it from the very first king all the way, the corruption all the way through. You can even see it in Hezekiah. You can see it in some of the good kings. Josiah had nothing wrong. Josiah's like, wow, this king's awesome. Okay, but if you read Chronicles, that's a whitewash. It's very different. It reads very differently. Yeah.
But it's sort of baffling. It's like Samuel was a very good guy. Like, well, it's not like the same person I have.
Yeah.
It's just amazing that he didn't celebrate Passover with the Israelites.
I'm sorry. The what?
It's interesting that Samuel didn't celebrate Passover with
Yeah.
the Israelites.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah, even though he was this great figure.
Nobody did. Nobody actually read the Torah very carefully. I think that's really the problem. It's like they actually started reading it. They had some general ideas, but I think the kings just were not interested in the Torah. So finally you had a king that actually read the Torah and says, hey, oh my gosh, look at this. And so...
So how does that instill hope if you have Josiah who read the Torah and had the heart of David and did everything right, and his reward is somewhat
Early death.
Early death.
Early
not
death.
peaceful
He's like 39, he gets shot. He dies at war.
Stabbed, yeah.
Yeah, he dies in battle. Yeah. Yeah. So we get back to that question about I will have mercy who I have mercy, I have compassion who I have compassion. Manasseh lives, the worst king in the world, lives 55 years, dies a peaceful death in bed. Josiah, the great king, dies early in battle.
But then how does that instill hope? If the authors are trying to make a sense of the whole history of Israel for the people.
Right. So I would say primary history, hope is minimized. Yeah, it's primarily about you deserved it, that's why you're here. It's answering the one question, if our God is the creator God and more so powerful, how the heck did this happen? That's the primary question being answered. Now in terms of hope, there's a little bit of hope at the end of the history in which the king gets released from prison, and the emperor of Babylon actually has him eat with him. At the table, tiny bit of hope. The Judah, but that's not much of a hope. The hope in the Old Testament comes from the prophets. You will see plenty of that, and come from the book of Psalms. You'll see plenty of that. Okay, I would not look to primary history as a source of hope, except to say that the promise to Abraham was unconditional, and the promise to David was unconditional. But by the time you get to the end of it, those themes are not prominent. I mean, we're talking about it as a whole. You have a couple touch points, but overall, it's about why you're there. But if we start going to prophets, we're going to see lots of prophecies of judgment, and we're going to see a lot of prophecies of after that. There's going to be a renewal or return.
Now, I heard this at some point.
Yeah.
That maybe the reason why they didn't celebrate the Sabbath was because they lost the book that contained instructions on how to celebrate the Sabbath, and so that they might have lost either Leviticus or Deuteronomy or whichever one. Yeah. And they said, and they only had one of them, and so they couldn't really celebrate things properly or something.
It's a good question. It didn't say when it was lost. It didn't say when it was. But remember that the Torah had all kinds of instructions on how to do sacrifices. So you would think that during David and Solomon's reign, and the priests they were using that as a priest handbook. How to do sacrifices. They were doing all this stuff.
But I meant to say that one of the books of the Torah was lost.
Oh, the one that the section that dealt with Passover.
Well, the section of the book that dealt with Passover.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mean Deuteronomy? I don't know. I mean, it's in multiple places in Deuteronomy and in Exodus.
Used often, right? At Hezekiah's time, again, it's something you discover in the Torah all of a sudden again, right? So that seems to happen several times. Somewhere in that period of kingship, the temple becomes a sort of management of God's, just around the sacrifices. That seemed to be doing sort of okay. Yeah. But somewhere all the other laws around how the king relates to the people, how the judgment of everyday life seems to have completely disappeared. Why do we not hear more of that? I mean, again, as a Christian today, when I read it, and when I read the Old Testament with my fellow believers, what seems to keep coming out is idolatry, the king's love of women. What seems to always get pushed back is that somehow the law of how you dealt and lived with the daily, with the everyday mundane, you never have to focus on that somehow when you read.
Right, because the storyline seems to be focused on the kings. It's focused. The judges is focused on the leaders. It's focused on the kings, and you're absolutely right. When we read through Leviticus and Deuteronomy, we assume that Israelite is now a kind of the people that live this out, and what we find out really is that they didn't live it out. It was kind of, as soon as it was initiated, it was promptly dropped and forgotten. It was not really lived out among the people. When you start reading about the prophets, you're going to start seeing that they didn't really live this out at all. And for example, what happened in Ruth is really a kind of an anomaly. And we'll talk about Ruth. We'll have a chance to get back to Ruth. I'm going to put that in. But that was anomalous. The people didn't follow. And
did the Jubilee ever happen?
No, never happened.
One time?
Never happened. No. So the prophets say you never celebrated the Jubilee. So all these idealistic laws in the Bible about land understanding never happened. These are kind of revolutionary ways to view land and ownership that God imposes or actually explains to them, and they never did it. So I think there's a lot to be said. Certainly today, for example, a lot of archaeological evidence showing a highly idolatrous Israel. Or people say, oh yeah, there's like Yahweh and his consort has been found in certain places in Israel. The Yahweh had a wife. Okay, and Yahweh is Ashtoreth. It's like, when you see all this, you think people go, yeah, okay, So people start, they're talking about, oh, you read the Bible, you think Israelites are monotheistic. But that's an impression you get from reading Leviticus and Deuteronomy. The real impression you should get is from Judges onward, that people were always doing some kind of mingling. They were doing syncretism. They were mixing Yahweh with everything else. That never stopped. It never ended. Okay. So what's the storyline became focused on is focused on just a few people, just the kings. Are the kings keeping them vaguely focused on God or not? The people, it never took off in the people. And they would say, Jeremiah would say, if you read Jeremiah, he would think, here's a Josiah reform. The reform, he got it off the ground. The moment he dies, it collapses. Why? There's no root. Okay. The people were not following. They would go with what the king says, and when the king says something else, they go follow that too. There's no root to it. There was no justice, and there was no true Yahweh worship among the people. So,
I think what I'm still trying to struggle, my personal tension is, even today, I think it's very easy to cleanse the temple and put the Bible on top of the altar and get some of the other stuff out.
Mm-hmm.
But in that process, it becomes very easy to forget how you live justice out in the everyday. And it seems as if the Bible's also set up in a weird way to help us along that road. When you read the prophets, somehow there is this comfort that this is going to be restored sometime in the future, so I can kind of wait till I die.
I hope that's not what the prophets are saying.
No, but I'm glad they don't actually say that. But when you do a reading of it today, this sort of making me kind of forget I can die.
Yeah.
I just have to live till I die, and then someone else is going to do the restoration. So, why is the Bible set up like that, or is it that we have we're reading it to our convenience, which I suppose everybody in every age did.
Okay. So you're asking the question: is the Bible set up to really push off personal responsibility on justice?
Yeah.
I would say,
that's a wonderful way
say no. It depends on which part of the Bible you read. I would say very strongly that primary history isn't focused on that. You'll notice the primary problem in primary history is idolatry. Okay, it's just that's the thing that this editor is focused on. There was all the stuff about what Manasseh did, and then one line: he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood. One line about injustice. Everything else was about idolatry.
Right.
Okay, so this editor, this guy is just zoned in on one issue. Okay, so it's no wonder if we just focus on primary history, we're not going to see all the justice issues, even though when Naboth the vineyard shows up. But the prophets are going to be much more that way. So we're going to get to. So like I said, I think we need to hear all the voices, but not to expect all the themes to be covered by every author. Okay, because I think they're going to take they're going to have different books are going to have different emphases, and we're going to allow them to do that, and we're going to allow them to have that voice and have somebody else have some other voice. So next time we meet, we'll be talking about the prophets and on the issue of social justice. We're going to start talking about what's it like on the ground living in Israel, and what kind of lives were like, and what was happening. So that's next week, next time we meet. So I would just say hold off.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Let me say one more line. I think you're getting that impression because we've been focused so much on primary history.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so we're letting one voice dominate right now.
I
Okay.
hear you,
Yeah.
but I also think that somehow that's the voice that dominates in much of the sermonology in church.
I see what you're saying. That's a different question.
Right.
Okay, that's not a question of the Bible or biblical theology. It's a question of because different books emphasize different things. If our preaching or our teaching sits on certain books of the Bible and ignore others, we're going to miss out on the whole counsel of the Word of God. And I think that's a very good point. biblical theology, the canonical synthesis requires that. You notice, we have 12 weeks together, but I've spent 8 weeks on primary history. Okay, that's my decision, and you can fault me on it. It says I happen to think that this storyline is the backbone of the Old Testament. All the other things attach into it. If you don't have this story down, you don't get the prophets. Okay, but I am going to spend some time on the prophets. We have 4 weeks left. We're going to spend time on prophets and on Book of Job. Sorry, a lot of other books are going to not getting any attention. And you're asking a good question, which is the balance in this decision making.
Yeah, is that decision making something that today's conversation only allows us to do this balance, or is there something about the Bible structure itself which makes it easier to do this kind of balance rather than, let's say, the kings you spend 2 weeks on the kings and spend 10 on
the prophets? That's a good question. I agree with you that the decisions that we make is subjective, based on what I think reflects the Old Testament overall. This is the issue of emphases, but it's basically the issue of quantity at this point. How many weeks on what? But maybe we can answer this question after we're all done, because then we can say, you're right. I think we've been ODing on primary history. Now we're going to leave, and we're going to hear very different voices and different themes going to show up, and we're going to get some different voices. And at the end, maybe you can say, okay, now was that a good balance? Could we have shifted the 6 weeks primary history, 6 weeks other things? Could we have done that? We'll see. Okay, Tom.
Great, thanks. So I've been aware of this. A couple things real quick. I've been enjoying N.T. Wright. He talks about divine identity.
Keep going.
And I've been thinking of this in the context of Madison and the university, as I've been on sabbatical at the university. And so I'm going to make a comment, see if you can agree or disagree and expand on it maybe. I feel like a lot of times in the modern times we look at primary history and we compare it to science as though the primary history of the Bible is giving a contrary science to modern science. And I would say that's not true at all. Primary history is not concerned with science. It's concerned with Yahweh's divine identity versus idolatry. That's the main subject of the primary history. And it's couched in the science of the day as it has to be. But basically the point is, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but the point is God's divine identity in contrast to the idolatry of the nations and of Israel.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think so. You're kind of getting at one of the reasons we deal with primary history quite a bit is it's in some ways verifiable. It's like this is about history, so we can try to verify it. Or is it just deals with history, science, like evolution, and so we start focusing on those things. And you're saying, look, the primary history is really about who God is, and really a rebuking of idolatry. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, who God is and what that tells about how He's calling a people.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah.
And that He's calling a people to be after His character. He's not explaining to us DNA. He's explaining to us, as John Donne might say, a moral DNA, a DNA after His character, but not a scientific DNA.
Okay.
Does that make some sense?
Yeah, I'm just not really sure why we're talking about science all of a sudden.
Well, just because I think because I'm concerned about science in the context of the university, and I think I think you are not dealing with science.
Yeah, I've actually strayed away completely, and I think you're saying that this. Okay, go ahead. Continue your thought.
Well, I think you're on the right track. I'm saying that you've strayed away from science, and you've enlightened us on a beautiful point about primary history. And we don't need to combat science because predominantly that's not what the Bible is teaching us. It's predominantly teaching us about divine identity.
Okay.
And that's 100% relevant in this day and age, and that's going to be 100% relevant 1,000 years from now, as opposed to trying to fight scientific battles.
Okay, I agree.
So I guess my final comment would just be that I appreciate. I think you're shining a light as far as the main point of the Old Testament. I think otherwise, I mean, you're saying this was, if the Old Testament is allowed to give its story on its own, this is what it says.
Right.
As opposed to that, the mistake is we take our questions and bring them to the Bible as opposed to listen to what the Bible is trying to tell us.
Okay.
That's the contrast I'm trying to highlight.
Right. Got it. No, I agree with you. I think the goal of this is to present the Old Testament's main points, its main thrusts, and what answers trying to answer, and what questions they don't answer at all. So I think, yeah, absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, but at
Thanks.
the same time, I mean, none of us is living in this void where we can clearly hear the Old Testament for what it says.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, my absolute favorite bit of the Old Testament doesn't even, it's not even within the ramparts of what we do here, which is God's encounter of Hagar. The slave, and how she's the first person to get the right to call God by a name that he agrees he will respond to. I mean, to me, that's the most powerful thing about the Old Testament. We never get to it. So, and it's fine. It's fine. So, I mean, I don't think the lines are quite as clear to say these are the three questions the exilic writer and editor had, and this is how he's answering it. Because again, as you often point out, Chronicles is given to us as a tension in that narrative. The editor put that in for what purpose? Not entirely clear. Or if he had a purpose, it's definitely at cross purposes with the rest of his questions.
So you're absolutely right. I think the theme of God's compassion on the poor and the helpless is clear in early parts of the primary history. The focus on rebellion and punishment becomes clear in the later parts of primary history. But I think God's concern for the poor and the powerless becomes more prominent in the prophets. When we do summaries of this sort, you just have to select. The selection criteria works like this. You're looking for points. You're looking. You don't want a kind of a summary. I summarize every chapter. That doesn't work. That's just what you want. You're looking for the clear storyline, which means whatever you pick out, it needs to continue on. That needs to repeat itself. So what I've done is look for themes that keep coming. So kingship, you can't miss that as a theme. So you need to track it all the way through. Individual people's rebellion, you track that all the way through. Those are themes that are like hitting you in the face, and they're so big that you can't really miss it. Other themes pop up all the time. That other scenes evoke all kinds of different themes, and if they don't continue, then you have to make a debate. Do I put it in? Because we're looking at the big picture.
Right. So
that's the selection criteria.
I mean, whoever's reading the Bible is already coming to the Bible with questions and looking for answers. So I think it's a bit of a cop-out to say we're looking at it, as if to say the Old Testament were by itself. I mean, it's like when I write my dissertation, my teachers always say, yes, let the data speak for itself, with a sort of snigger, data never speaks.
Of course. So you do. I mean, this is why I think we're talking about post-critical or post-realism, post-critical realism, in which we all understand that we're making selections.
Right.
At the same time, we're getting at something that's real, that's something that's closer. We're not going to go off and say, you know what, because of that, I'm going to impose whatever I want on the text. There is something still very different about coming in and saying, okay, here's the Old Testament storyline. I'm going to create a Christian's approach and look at it and says, okay, now where's the part about Jesus? Or here's salvation, here's false salvation redemption structure to the text. That's very much something external. That's not organic to the text. So I think we can recognize there's a difference without just saying, oh, because you can't hit the absolute, you therefore you just completely give up. So I think that's where we're at. I think that's where we're at. Not giving up, and still be able to discern in some ways here's a summary that's organic to the text. Here's a summary that is really imposed with a system outside. Now, would you say this one has no imposition? Yeah, there is. The question I'm asking, the selection criteria that I've created, why those? Why did I just created one that says, I want thematic continuity. That's my criteria. I want themes that repeat throughout the primary history, and I will highlight those. Why that? That seems arbitrary. Well, I don't know, arbitrary. It sounds okay. It sounds like it's a good one. But can I defend it? Except to say it makes sense. It's logical. Yeah. So that's all I got. And I would say versus somebody who comes along and says, well, I'm going to divide the Old Testament into dispensations, into these periods. There's nothing in the text about dispensations. You know what I'm saying? So
I hear you, Charles. And I have such the deepest admiration for what you did because
no, I'm totally copped to the idea that there's subjectivity involved.
Yeah.
When we do exegesis, there's less. When we do canonical synthesis, that's what I'm doing right now. There's most subjectivity, because you're trying to do
As we do it, is there actually someone who's reading Rorty and Derrida and sort of trying to understand how the Torah got put together?
Yeah.
Is there anyone doing it?
There's lots of people doing this kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people doing post. So this is the question of if you go full postmodern. And see, if you go Foucault and see all of this as a way of power, then I think you're counter-reading the text, and you're putting yourself above the text. And some people do that. And I think as a committed Christian, I'm going to say, I'm not denying my subjectivity, but I'm doing my darndest to avoid it, instead of embracing it. I think that attitude is important. That I'm going to submit to the author the best way I can. And if you can show, if we're reading, if you show me something that's disagreeing with me, I'm going to really resist any attempt to run roughshod over it. I'm going to let it have its full force on me. Now, people are still going to accuse me that I'm not fully successful. I'm okay with that.
No, but I think that's the point. The point is not to say that anyone's going to be able to stand outside and transcend it,
right.
But to say that we're all therefore subjective. We're all in this room somehow very happy with saying Chronicles is a whitewash. My mom would kill me for saying that. Right?
Well, but here's the thing, okay? It's an interesting question, how to read Chronicles. The Chronicles, Chronicles, Kings, primary history, voice is a very interesting one. And at some point, maybe we'll have to address that. Because, like I said, we're only letting one voice speak right now. One voice has had the floor for about 8 weeks now. And other voices are going to start coming in. And they're going to start having conversations with each other. I'm of the mind that God let us have Chronicles to show, this is, my subject is showing up completely, and I would say God let us have Chronicles to show us what happens to a people who need to justify their existence. So I'm going to let their voice speak, and I'm going to let the kings speak, and I'm going to say, you see the whitewashing that happens when you become ethnocentric, that your goal is no longer about the world, it's about yourself and your status. So I go in a way that's going to shock a lot of people, but I think that's a legitimate reading. But a lot of people can agree with me, including my mentor, Bruce Walke. So say you're crazy. But I'm going to argue that Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah moves us toward by the time of Jesus, Pharisaism. Okay, that's the trend line coming out of the Old Testament. Primary history says we're failure, we're sinful, and we need grace. We need God to restore us. Chronicle, Ezra, and Nehemiah says we're actually not that bad. Okay, David's pretty good. And what we need to do is we need to follow Torah better. So one is total depravity. Okay, now I'm imposing later theological terms, but one is just failure. Humanity needs renewed. One says let's follow Torah better, and that two trends are going to meet up in the Gospels. Okay, so that's my canonical synthesis. Nobody else is telling me to do that. Okay, but I find that a provocative reading because I feel like in the New Testament one side gets slapped down and says this is wrong, and the other one is the right way. Which is why I emphasize primary history over Ezra and Nehemiah Chronicles. So
yeah. I guess a couple of questions. One is, what is the context in which Chronicles was written? Was that written in the exile as well?
It's most likely exile, post-exile.
Okay, so maybe there's already some restoration.
Yes, that's precisely the point. Is that the chronicler is trying to write to people in Jerusalem, telling them you deserve to be here. Okay, you're not some interloper who came out of foreign land. This land belongs to you, belongs to your forefather. God promised it to Abraham, and we have this great king named David, and we need to build a temple. Okay.
So they're building walls at that point.
They're building temple.
They're ourselves. We're good people.
Right. So they're trying to survive in a massive Persian empire. They're trying to survive. So this is about culture. It's about affirmation of your culture. Primary history is about you guys stink. Okay. Chronicles says you guys are pretty decent. Why? Because I think rhetorically they had to happen. They need that They need that faith that says we deserve to be here. We are a real people. We should be here, and we should build the walls and build the temple. So the chronicler is dealing with a different rhetorical situation, different rhetorical questions. Is God strong enough? Is God powerful enough? Are we going to be able to pull this off? Right? And then it veers into Ezra and Nehemiah, where they drew the conclusion, which is we need to really follow the Torah better. So first thing first, divorce all your wives. They divorced Gentile wives. Okay, it's like, whoa, how did this happen? Right? You think, is that right? Is that the thing to do? Okay, the text doesn't say. It's a little unclear whether God approved of that, but it was clear to the leader they're saying we should get rid of the wives. They banned Gentiles from the court of Yahweh. That was not in the Old Testament. The Old Testament only banned, there's like two nations, the Moabites and somebody else, who are not allowed in the temple. They took that and says, okay, let's make sure, let's expand it to all Gentiles. Okay, so you have the Ezra. Okay, I'm going to talk. This is going to be one of the discussions we're going to have later. Sorry, I'm going to give you foreground, but we're going to talk about universalism as a theme. That we're going to have the ethnocentrism and the universalism of the whole storyline. We're going to contrast Ezra and Nehemiah with Jonah / 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. That's all about, the temple and the nations being brought in. So these two trends are coming to the fore in the exile, post-exilic period. So we're going to talk about this. So I think we'll see it in more detail. Yes. I'll give you previews.
During the time of Jesus, did the Israelites have the Old Testament as we pretty much know it?
Yes. They call it the law and the prophets and the writings. Yeah.
Okay. They haven't lost it or something.
They haven't lost. They haven't. Oh yeah. They got it down.
About it. Okay.
So, but they know it better than anybody else. Good. By the time of Israel. Yeah. So if you think about the people who came back, the people who came back are the ones who have something to gain. Either the people who really bought into it, or the descendants of David. They're like, hey, kingship, cool. Okay, so they came back, and the people who really believed came back, and they took their Torah reading very seriously. And from then on, and I would say through the Greek period, in which there's massive persecution of the Jewish people for circumcision and for Torah, for Sabbath keeping. When you have that, they had to make a distinction between texts that are what we call defile the hand versus one that didn't. Ones that didn't, you can hand it to the Greeks for burning. That's okay, but Hebrew Bible texts, you have to protect them with your life. You're willing to sacrifice your life to protect them. So by the time of Jesus, I would say that Hebrew Bible, as we have them, was revered. Okay, and Pharisees who kept the law properly were at the highest strata in terms of people's evaluations of them. Okay, so Pharisees were wonderful people by the people's standards. We read through the New Testament. We don't like. We toss Pharisees as an insult. That would not be the case in the first century. Yeah.
So another thing, kind of getting back to Tom's point about the science, is I think we live in in an era where we have a way we approach history. We have a scientific understanding of history.
Yeah.
And we read a story like the Kings, and we think history because we're reading something that sounds a lot like history, but it's not.
It's not
in the same way. Yeah.
No, absolutely not.
So, getting to Tom's point, keeping in mind that this is not history in the sense that we understand it.
Right.
This is the point of the story.
Let me back it up and say that we use the word history loosely, and I think we need to be more clear. History is a word. You can say something is history. You mean it is in the genre of historiography, okay? Which really means it's a historian trained in historical writing and goes back and looks at the data and writes down an account that fits today's plausibility structure. That's what we call history. Okay, it's somebody present today writing about something in the past, but that fits because he's going to bring up issues of causality. He's going to bring up issues of connections that really fits the history writing conventions of this historian's day. Okay, I'm not saying that's not objective. It's wrong or anything. I'm just saying that's the reality of history writing. Another term people write when they say history, they mean is did it actually happen?
Right.
Okay, that's different from whether it's history or not. Okay, so I would strongly argue that the Book of Kings is not in the genre of contemporary history. It is not written the same way. They don't go through the same data. They don't approach data similarly. They don't have the voice of objectivity that many historians today adopt, or that's kind of been the modern historian approach. Even though today I think a lot of people are becoming a little bit more memoirist kind of approaches that are, they say, intentionally blending the lines. But I would say Enlightenment history is very much objective neutral. Today historians are a little bit more self-aware, but even then they still write history. This one, absolutely not. This one is prophetic history. It's written from the voice of a person who says, I know the mind of God. Okay? So I'm going to evaluate all the events that happened based on certain theological principles about God did this, God did not do that, that was sinful, that was wrong. It was very extremely evaluative. Every king got a thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay? Did what is right in the sight of the Lord, did evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay? Follow Jeroboam, the sin of Jeroboam, follow the ways of David. Follow the ways of David. It's just kind of this constant evaluation. To say that it's not by genre a history, it's not to say that it doesn't make any historical claims. It does. It claims that events happened. But because the genre conventions are different, this is where, really, in English is the problem. It makes claims to think events happening, but its description of them fall into a genre that doesn't have the same level of precision as our modern day historiography.
But also I wonder if there's some narrative elements, because if you
absolutely
read, like, Genesis, you get this kind of mythical line,
right.
Whereas Kings, you can kind of, it's nothing in there is really so obviously contradictory to our current understanding of science. Well,
when the sun stopped and the shadows moved backwards.
Okay.
Whoa.
Okay.
right. There are problems in there. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe there's some narrative extrapolation that's going on there too.
So what I would get at is the precision. It's making some historical claims about things happening, but the storytelling, the scientific assumptions are all of those day, and its precision fits the genre of its time. It doesn't fit our current genre of precision. When I mean a precision, I also talk about scientific facts. I mean that as well. Okay, it's operating in a different realm than us. And if we go into reading and going, oh, it says this king reigned for 40 years. In exactly 40 years, and people have done that, they run into all kinds of chronological problems. Okay? And there's all kinds of chronological problems. And you shouldn't realize 40 doesn't mean 40. Okay? 40 is a nice number.
Yeah.
40 is a great number. 40 is a perfect number. So there's also co-regency, there's overlapping numbers, there's what we call dyschronology, in which stories are told in the wrong chronological order. That's wrong is already problematic. Wrong is already anachronistic. In an order that's not natural flow of time. They do that all the time, and that was okay by their generic conventions, not okay by our conventions, but that is problematic for us to call that wrong, because we're imposing a foreign value on it. Okay, it is entirely correct once you get what they're trying to do, but don't let it therefore it's saying something happened, but I'm going to tell it in a way that works within my genre. And the people, they're not going to mislead anybody, but we have higher level expectations of precision, and therefore we say, oh, that's wrong. The mistakes aren't really our problem.
Yeah, I guess the other side of it is you can read it, if you're thinking of it as history, and you could say, well, God is this very capricious, he's meting out punishment here and there.
Yeah.
But if you read it from the context in which they're writing it, then you have to take it as an entire story.
Yes.
Rather than like individual events that are taking place.
Right.
Because all of that is seen in hindsight.
Yes.
From the viewpoint of the person writing the story now.
Exactly. So this has been the challenge of this class. Actually, the main point of this class is one is to get a big picture. We frequently, I think one of the biggest problem in churches, and I don't want to critique churches, the sermons are 40 minutes long, and you do a few verses, and then you have that application. So you dive into verses. Very few preachers are able to consistently give you the bigger picture and how your particular pericope that you're reading fits into the larger story. So what I have here is an advantage that most pastors do not have. I have 2 hours over a year, like 12 times, to say, here's the whole story of the Old Testament. Now once you got it, you can pull any passage out of the Old Testament and immediately fit it into this, say, where the heck is it? Wow. Where did it go? All right, there must be a better way to do this. But I'm committed to it by now. There we go. You can pull any passage out and know where you are in the storyline. And once you know where you are in the storyline, it's the thematic concerns begin to show. You start understanding the thematic concerns. Because when we do exegesis, we read the passage and then we understand the larger discourse. Its role in the larger discourse. And in a story like this, you actually have to fit into the larger discourse. Not just the book of Deuteronomy, but the book of the whole thing. You actually have to fit it. So, because it's one edited volume. Okay. So I think the biggest weakness that we have is in the church today is that we know passages of Scripture, but we don't have the whole picture.
I think also the other tension that, at least as I've been listening to this particular conversation, there's two viewpoints. There's some of us who are still responding to a modern Enlightenment view of history, which is Storm's concern about scienticism versus the historic notions of the Bible. That's just one part of the story. Today, I think the challenge to biblical authority isn't coming from that modernist viewpoint. It's coming from this deeply postmodern notion of what's the power that makes the narrative? What's the power that identifies one story over the other? The challenge is coming also from where is everyone else? Those kinds, and as someone who
what do you mean, where is everyone else? Can you explain that? I didn't quite understand that.
This is in a way a very ethnocentric.
It's Israel. It's all about Israel. Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
And I don't think in the church, particularly churches I grew up to and continue to go to, we don't ever call it ethnocentric, which is in fact to say what it is.
Well, it absolutely is.
And it's problematic.
Yes.
So all of those things are where the challenges are coming from. And I'm skating at the edge of my own ability to talk about these things, but the notion of communal reading, the notion of meaning creation, the anthropological writing of the Bible. You mentioned historiography, and what you talked about was sort of distinguishing historicism from historiography versus narrative. The whole notion of narrative and story, I don't know that we understand that entirely. That's where the challenge is.
So I've been doing narrative.
You have.
Yes.
And I think you have done it wonderfully well. And I think also that at some point we have to acknowledge that we take this narrative on faith, a particular kind of faith.
And you're making a very good point. I want to emphasize this, is that you're absolutely right. In many ways, churches are fighting the modernist battle. They're doing the apologetics of trying to prove historical accuracy by using archaeology. And you're getting at that the new generation are really saying, where's the power of this? What is the story about?
What is it
how does this ring true? And this story has to ring true for people to say, this story has better explanatory power for my life than some other story. And that's really the battle of the meta narrative, the grand narratives.
Right.
And So I'm hoping that that's what I'm trying to accomplish. I'm saying this story is about humanity, it's about rulership, and it's about multiple nations in Tower of Babel, and then we're talking about shrinking down to a single nation as a solution to that, and watching that this solution fall apart. Now, we haven't got to the end yet, because the New Testament really is the ending. So, but this story arc, I'm not going to try to say, believe it because here's archaeological proof. But rather, this has power in your life. It explains what your life is about. And when you hear it, you go, yeah, that makes sense. And that, I think that's actually where its power comes from. Not from our ability to then verify the individual points. I'm in agreement with you on that.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure there are people working much more on this. But you know, I in much of the text, much of world history, which is all Eurocentric, I don't exist. I mean, the subaltern does not exist, never gets heard.
Yeah.
So when I read the Bible, I'm always trying to excavate the subaltern from
but this is the subaltern. The Israelite history is a history of the subaltern.
Which does that point actually get made? I mean, it doesn't get made. Somehow when you read the text, because we study Israel.
They were a small little nation. They were slaves.
Right.
They were the oppressed ones. They go there. They build their own little nation. They get taken over by the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks. They're always under.
Right.
Right. So this is not a history of the United States or the Roman Empire. This is a history of a people that should have disappeared by all rights long ago. Okay. So maybe I should make that point. Yeah.
I mean, say no more, because we keep running into that problem of, we talk about Israel all the time, and suddenly Israel is the hero. In a way, he is the hero.
Well, not really. Not in primary history.
But he is the story that will then
result in that, right?
Resolution.
Right.
So but to say that. And Israel is the subaltern. But again, I mean, in that idea, there's all other kinds of injustice that gets obscured.
Yes.
In that. I mean,
and like I said, we will spend time on the universalism aspect, and we will spend time on the justice issue. They will come up. Just primary history doesn't do a good job of it. I have to agree with you on that. But it can't say everything. Other people will say things, which is a good thing. Yeah. You want to say something, Rick? You had a reaction? No. Okay. Good. Well, thank you very much. Let's pray. We're well over time again. Father, we're grateful for your word. We're grateful for the story. And we want to know it. We want it to be the kind of the story that how we see ourselves through it. How the story that identifies who we are and that identifies our community. Let it be the story that shape our status, our self-concept, and eventually the world our view of the world. We want that deep of a transformation in our mind and our hearts. Help us, Father. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, John.